Anyone who has tried to challenge a large institution knows the feeling. You hit a brick wall of scale and procedure. The corporation seems to hold all the cards, and the maze shifts and rebuilds itself every time you try to find a way through. The human instinct in that situation is to tell your story. You think if you can just explain the timeline or appeal to a sense of fairness, someone on the inside will listen. You present the facts, hoping linear logic will win out. That is a trap. Institutions counter stories with narrative fog. They deploy massive document volume, unexplained delays, and polite euphemisms designed to drown you. Your timeline gets buried. We tend to view that massive scale as an unbeatable advantage, but scale creates its own problems. An entity that large has to keep thousands of internal surfaces aligned. That density is actually a fatal vulnerability. You cannot persuade a system of that size. To win, you have to stop treating the institution like a sovereign person who can be reasoned with, and start treating it as a rigid algorithm that can be mapped. Large institutions appear chaotic from the outside. Inside, they are severely restricted. Every decision has to pass through layers of risk management, legal defensibility, and reputational protection. These overlapping rules choke off their flexibility. An international organization cannot improvise. It has to select safe, familiar administrative paths, forcing its behavior into highly predictable, repetitive patterns. This diagram illustrates what happens when you strip away the emotional rhetoric. You start to see a basic mathematical function. Messy human variables go in, they hit a processing rule, and identical restrictive outputs come out. When you look at the logic gates inside that processing box, your central question changes. You stop asking, "Why did this happen to me?" And you start asking, what specific assumptions did the system have to make for this decision to be allowed? This approach treats institutional pressure as data. A sudden 6-month delay, total silence, or a shift in how they label your case becomes a measurable output of their risk management function. Systems are trained to handle compliant participants or angry complainants. If you refuse to play either of those roles, you become an out-of-distribution input. The machine cannot classify you cleanly, so it falters and defaults to generic containment protocols. Because institutions optimize for scalable, repeatable treatment, they eventually revert to default decision corridors. Logging every delay and terminological shift allows you to identify these corridors, effectively creating a map that predicts their next administrative move. A human being can spot these patterns in a few documents, but when an administrative file swells to tens of thousands of pages, the brain gets tired. You lose track of a subtle wording shift between month 2 and month 18. This is where artificial intelligence becomes critical. It acts as an analytical exoskeleton, a structural force that holds thousands of data points in active memory so you can map the entire cognitive landscape at once. You can apply specific strategies like contradiction mapping. You feed the AI a hypothesis about the institution's rules and command it to scan the entire record to find exactly where their actions violate their own policies. Here we see a visualization of language drift detection. You ask the system to track how a single descriptor evolves. What starts as a mild concern steadily turns into a risk and finally hardens into a procedural necessity to justify a restriction. Then you run negative space research. You prompt the AI to identify the mandatory procedural steps that the institution was supposed to take between those labels, exposing the specific assessments they deliberately skipped. This exoskeleton cuts right through the narrative fog. It takes the institution's hidden, disjointed machinery and drags it out into the open, laying every flaw bare for examination. All this leads to the ultimate strategy, rift-based legal reasoning. You stop trying to prove that the institution lied or acted unfairly. Your goal is to prove that their underlying structures cannot coexist. In this model, you take the institution's stated rules and slide them directly over their logged actions. When the two structures fail to align, you expose a rift. It's the exact point where their administrative framework fractures the logic they are trying to enforce. This methodology relies on structural demonstration. You show exactly how a specific set of inputs was converted into a restrictive output, presenting forensic proof that the system's own processing rules are broken. This reveals the true asymmetry of the dispute. The institution has the size and the resources, but it is permanently trapped. It cannot step outside of its own procedures, rigid categories, and defensive habits. An individual operating with this analytical discipline is completely untethered. You have the cognitive distance to observe the system from the outside, predict its next maneuver, and dismantle its logic by looking down at the maze rather than running through it. Structural mapping transfers the strategic advantage to the single observer. By understanding the giant's mechanics, you gain the ability to turn its own logic against the system.